For years, Bishop Talbert W. Swan stood at the center of faith, fire, and fierce conviction, a man who could command a room with his voice and silence a crowd with his stare. Yet behind all the sermons, behind the authority, behind the boldness that made him both loved and criticized, there was a storm brewing that no one outside his closest circle could truly see, a storm made of whispers that followed him from pulpits to parking lots, from church pews to Twitter threads, from quiet phone calls to public debates, whispers that questioned who he really was when the robe was off and the doors were closed, whispers that asked whether the man people saw on stage was the same man who walked the halls of his own home, whispers that kept growing louder as the years went on. At 59, after decades of leadership, influence, and tension between admiration and suspicion, Bishop Talbert W. Swan has finally broken his silence. Not with a rehearsed statement, not with a press release, not with the image polishing that so many public figures hide behind, but with confession that instantly split the faith community down the middle. He admitted that some of the rumors people had debated for years were not baseless attacks or lies invented by critics, but reflections of decisions and struggles he had tried to handle alone, behind closed doors, believing that leadership required silence, that authority required secrecy, that the weight of being called bishop meant he could not show the cracks forming beneath the title. And as he spoke, his words hit like lightning, because this wasn't the voice of a man trying to defend himself, it was the voice of a man finally telling the truth. He admitted that there were moments when pride led him farther than purpose, moments where the applause of the crowd felt louder than the whisper of God, moments where control felt easier than vulnerability. He spoke of internal battles that no one saw, decisions made under the pressure of expectation, relationships strained by the weight of leadership, and emotional exhaustion that had been masked by authority. This was the part that shook people the most. He revealed that the silence wasn't protection, it was fear. Fear of disappointing the people who saw him as a pillar, fear of being seen as flawed, fear of losing respect, fear of being human in a world that demands perfection from its leaders. And as the confession spread, those who once whispered began to listen differently. Longtime supporters were stunned, realizing that the man they defended was not invincible. Critics found themselves speechless, realizing that beneath their accusations was a human being carrying a burden no one would want. The faith community found itself staring into a mirror because his confession wasn't just about him, it was about the culture of silence in the church. The expectations placed on leaders to be superhuman, the demand for perfection that crushes the very souls meant to guide others. His words didn't destroy his legacy, they revealed the cost of it. And now, every believer, every skeptic, every critic watching is forced to ask the same question. What happens when the robe becomes armor, when the pulpit becomes a stage, and when the calling begins to drown the one who carries it? Because what Bishop Swan just did wasn't just confession, it was a challenge, one that is about to change everything. Family, friends, and colleagues watched the whispers turn into waves, and the waves into storms, unsure how to help a man who stood at the center of it all while trying to keep his dignity intact. Every conversation grew heavy, every glance lingered too long, every prayer circle felt like it was half intercession and half plea for clarity. The rumors didn't just circle outside the church, they seeped into choir rehearsals, leadership meetings, whispered phone calls, and late-night text threads. Some defended him fiercely, others quietly wondered, while many simply didn't know what to believe. And yet, Bishop Talbert W. Swan kept going. He kept preaching, advocating, showing up to rallies, speaking truth to power, leading community initiatives, posting boldly on social media, refusing to be silent or small. But what no one saw was the weight he carried when the microphones were off and the lights faded. Behind closed doors, he was fighting to maintain his identity while the world around him tried to define it for him. He processed betrayal from those who once stood beside him, navigated the pressure of expectations that felt impossible, and fought to separate his calling from the image others forced upon him. And then came the moment no one anticipated. At 59, before his congregation, his leadership team, and a camera rolling live to thousands, Bishop Swan finally chose truth over silence. Not polished truth, not political truth, not rehearsed truth, but raw, vulnerable, unshielded truth. His voice didn't shake, but the room did. He spoke of private battles, of decisions that were misunderstood, of times he acted quickly where he should have listened longer, of leadership carried under the weight of public scrutiny that never paused. He addressed the internal conflicts within his ministry, confirming that disagreements had happened, not because of corruption, but because leadership is not a throne. it is a battlefield. He acknowledged that there had been tension over financial direction, staffing choices, strategic visions, and the demands of a congregation that expected perfection from a man still growing, still learning, still human. And then he did the unthinkable. He admitted that some of the most persistent rumors weren't inventions, but reflections of real struggles he never allowed himself to voice. Moments where the pressure of being the bishop led him to make choices he later questioned. Moments where he put the mission before his own emotional well-being. Moments where he forgot that God called him to be human, not invulnerable. When he spoke those words, the sanctuary fell silent. Not with judgment, but with recognition, because for the first time, the congregation saw not the robe, not the title, not the voice thundering through microphones. They saw the man. Social media exploded. Some proclaimed this was the transparency the church had needed for generations. Others insisted the confession confirmed everything they suspected. But those closest to the moment, those sitting in the very seats he had preached to for years, knew something else entirely. This wasn't scandal. This was liberation. This was the moment leadership became truth. The moment strength became honesty. The moment the myth of the perfect pastor shattered so the real man could finally breathe. And whether people agreed with him, questioned him, criticized him, or praised him, everything changed that day. Because once truth has been spoken, it cannot be taken back. And now the world is left to decide what to do with it. For others, his confession was like a jolt to the system, a reminder that no pastor, bishop, leader, or public figure is beyond the weight of truth, and that sometimes the truth does not arrive quietly. It lands like thunder, shaking everything in its path. What made the moment even more powerful was the timing. At 59, an age where many leaders begin to polish their legacy, build their final chapters, and cement their reputation, Bishop Talbert W. Swan chose instead to open the door to vulnerability, to stand in the light with nothing to hide behind. The confession did not feel like damage control. It felt intentional, reflective, and deeply personal. He wasn't just responding to rumors, he was reclaiming his identity from the noise that had surrounded him for decades. He spoke with the tone of a man who had seen his reflection from every angle, both the greatness and the flaws, and decided that honesty was the only way forward. Yet the confession didn't tie everything neatly into a conclusion. Instead, it sparked 1,000 new questions. If these rumors were true, what did that mean for the ministry built under his leadership? Would longtime allies stand beside him or quietly step away, distancing themselves to protect their own image? Would the church that he had poured his entire life into embrace him with grace? Or would they struggle to reconcile the man they loved with the truth he finally spoke? Within the congregation, emotions clashed like storms. Some members cried openly during the confession, feeling a release they didn't know they needed. Others sat frozen, trying to process the collision of admiration and disappointment happening inside them. Conversations spilled out into church hallways, living rooms, and group chats. People wrestled with questions of loyalty, forgiveness, accountability, and the tension between admiring a leader and acknowledging his flaws. Meanwhile, social media turned into a battlefield. Supporters praised him as a model of courageous transparency, saying that real leadership is not perfection, it is responsibility. They called his honesty a breakthrough, a moment that could change how churches worldwide deal with leadership struggles. But the critics were loud too. Some questioned whether the confession was incomplete, carefully crafted to reveal just enough without exposing everything. Others insisted the timing was calculated, a strategic move to control the narrative before something bigger surfaced. Comment sections, live stream chat threads, and Twitter timelines exploded with opinion. Pastors from around the country weighed in. Some defended him publicly, saying his humility reflected true spiritual maturity. Others indirectly criticized him from their pulpits, preaching sermons about integrity, failure, and spiritual accountability without mentioning his name. But everyone knew. Yet the reactions inside his own ministry were the ones that mattered most. Some leaders felt closer to him than ever before, believing that transparency would strengthen the church rather than weaken it. Others wrestled with quiet doubt, unsure if trust could be rebuilt as easily as words could be spoken. And just when people thought the confession was the climax of the story, insiders began to whisper that there was more. Personal history, family tension, events behind the scenes that shaped the man far more deeply than any rumor ever could. The confession wasn't an ending, it was the opening of a door that had been locked for years, a door that, now open, may reveal more truth than anyone is prepared to face. And the world is watching, waiting, holding its breath, wondering if the next chapter will be redemption or reckoning. Media outlets moved in instantly, dissecting every frame of the confession like it was a national breaking news event. Headlines lit up screens across the country. Talk show hosts debated his tone. Body language analysts paused and rewound footage to examine every blink, every breath, every subtle shift in his voice. It wasn't just what Bishop Talbert W. Swan said, it was how he said it, calm, steady, heavy, like a man who had wrestled with his own truth long before ever speaking it aloud. Some journalists called it one of the most significant moments in modern faith leadership, a rare instance of vulnerability from a figure who had once seemed unshakable. Others dismissed it as strategic damage control, arguing that transparency only came when silence was no longer sustainable. But whether praised or criticized, one thing was undeniable. People were watching, and they were feeling something deeply. Then came the insider revelations. Former staff, longtime members, and individuals close to Bishop Swan began to share what they described as context the public didn't receive. Stories of late-night board meetings, fractured leadership decisions, quiet disagreements that had been held behind closed doors for years. It poured gasoline on an already blazing conversation. Who had influenced who? Where had the lines blurred, and how much had been covered for the sake of protecting the image of the ministry? The suspense only grew. And yet, in the middle of the storm, something surprising happened. A wave of unwavering support rose up around him. Not out of blind loyalty, but out of recognition. People saw themselves in his humanity. They saw struggle, pressure, expectation, and the deep exhaustion of carrying a calling that sometimes weighs more than flesh and bone can bear. Online, hashtags of encouragement began to circulate. Pastors preached sermons on grace. Panels discussed the emotional cost of leadership. Podcasts highlighted the loneliness of public responsibility. Even critics who had spoken against him were forced to acknowledge that honesty, real honesty, is rare, and carrying secrets is a burden that breaks even the strongest of men. Meanwhile, families who had been shaped by his ministry sat around kitchen tables asking hard questions about what it means to follow someone flawed. Bible study groups debated leadership and grace. Some cried, some got angry. Some finally understood the weight of being both leader and human, and as the conversations deepened, it became clear. The confession was not the end of the story. It was the turning point, the moment where perception cracked open to reveal the person behind the pulpit. And yet the most powerful part was the lingering silence afterward. The silence where people realized the truth was bigger than the rumors. The silence where faith was tested not by miracles, but by humanity. The silence where the church had to decide whether it believed in redemption as much as it preached it. And just when the world thought the confession was the final chapter, insiders whispered that there was still more beneath the surface. Personal history, family wounds, decisions made under pressure, pain shaped long before the pulpit. The confession wasn't closure, it was the beginning of a story finally being told in full. And now, everyone is watching, not to see a man fall, but to see who he becomes next. For years, the faith community was left grasping at fragments, whispers, assumptions, unanswered questions, trying to make sense of the silence surrounding Bishop Talbert W. Swan. People filled the gaps with whatever narrative they could shape, because when a leader does not speak, the silence itself becomes a story. But when he finally chose to step forward at 59, his voice carried the weight of decades of expectation. What he offered was not justification, not defense, but truth. A truth that reminded everyone watching that transparency, even when it cuts deep, holds more power than any polished image ever could. His confession became more than a statement. It became a mirror held up not only to his own life, but to the churches, congregations, and communities that had elevated him. He reminded the world that leaders are not divine. They are human. They wrestle, they struggle, they break, they heal. And in revealing that humanity, he bridged the space between the pulpit and the pews, allowing people to see the man behind the voice, the flaws behind the faith, the storm behind the sermons. His honesty challenged the impossible expectations placed on spiritual leaders. The expectation to be unshakable, untouchable, untouched by human vulnerability. Instead of weakening his legacy, it strengthened it, because it showed that true leadership is not measured in perfection, but in courage. And his courage was undeniable. He spoke of the delicate balance he had tried to maintain, leading a congregation while trying to silence his own storms, fighting for justice while battling personal pressures, being a public pillar while privately unraveling. The confession was not only an unveiling of past challenges, but a display of what it means to stand in truth after years of endurance. It sparked conversations far beyond the walls of his church. Pastors, scholars, believers, skeptics, everyone began to wrestle with the same questions. What does accountability truly look like? How do we restore trust when leaders fall? Can redemption and responsibility coexist? And perhaps the most powerful question of all, what does it mean to follow someone who is no longer hiding? His transparency did not erase the controversies. It reframed them. It allowed healing to begin, not just for him, but for the community that had been quietly torn between loyalty and doubt. And now his future holds a different kind of power, a power not built on image, but on integrity. He is no longer leading from a pedestal, but from the ground, where people bleed, breathe, and rise again. Younger leaders are now looking at him as an example, not of flawlessness, but of the bravery it takes to confront one's own reflection. His confession became a blueprint for a new kind of leadership, one shaped by honesty, humility, accountability, and transformation. And yet, the story is not done. The confession was not the conclusion, but the doorway to a new chapter, one where his legacy will not simply be remembered for influence or controversy, but for the courage to speak truth when silence would have been easier. The world is still watching, not to see if he falls again, but to see what he becomes now that he has stopped hiding.